I've always thought it's important to notice the little things, like how someone moves in their chair when I'm skilled at lying, making their eyes dart away at the wrong time, and smiling too perfectly and practicedly. Developed primarily as a survival strategy throughout time. And this morning, as I sat at our weekly family breakfast, my sister-in-law Caroline's dining table was yelling at me. Jessica, my wife, presented me with a steaming cup of coffee, and her lips curled into that delicious, her voice was as silky as silk, and she continued, "You are a special coffee, honey," with an easy smile that she had mastered over the years. Although I don't consider myself a coffee expert, I am aware of the rich, earthy scent that coffee should have. Before you even take a sip, the air is filled with a rich bitterness. Something twisted in my stomach the moment the vapor touched my nostrils, revealing an underlying sin. I didn't react, and my face didn't reveal anything. It was subtle, but definitely metallic. Flash of suspicion, I picked up the cup and slowly swirled the dark liquid. Pretending to be appreciative of her work, I whispered, grinning a little. Jessica's eyes briefly twitched in response, hardly perceptible unless you knew what to look for across the table, Caroline. You were searching. With her long nails tapping across the porcelain, she idly stirred her own coffee. Played the part of the casual observer, waiting and acting as though she was unaware of what was going on. Behind the scenes, I discovered the hard way that nothing was ever casual with these two, and I've been ill for the past year. More times than I can remember, I was unable to stand due to severe nausea and stomach problems that kept me lying, down in bed. ER visits with doctors baffled by my body's constant betrayal and unable to provide an explanation. It always happened as a coincidence during one of these breakfasts at Caroline's house or after a meal that Jessica had made. I had wild theories, of course, but maybe just once or twice. Any rational person would reject these twisted notions. But I discovered that ignoring the warning signs didn't make them vanish, so I had a plan for today. So I pulled for my phone and pretended to check a message before I just barely hit the table with a well-timed stumble, to cause a little period of mayhem by making the cups clatter just enough. Ah, crap. I stabilizing myself with a grumble, Jessica's hand sprang out, her fingers clutching the edge of the table. Possibly a natural reaction. However, her gaze immediately shifted to my coffee cup. Not me. The cup that revealed I quickly got everything I needed to know as I straightened up and reached out to trade coffees with Caroline. Caroline scarcely noticed that it was a move that you learned after years of playing defense in a game you never joined up for. Looked up, but Jessica was too preoccupied with whatever she was typing on her phone. I observed the instant of doubt in the way her throat moved, but she recognized that she recovered swiftly and forced another smile. Worked as she cautiously gulped honey, saying, "Don't be too light in your voice." I chuckled and raised the new cup to my lips, not wanting you to spill the special coffee I made for you. My gut twisted in knots as I pretended to sip the smell, but it wasn't my concern anymore. I put the cup back on the table and waited for 30 minutes. Caroline didn't realize it yet, but she was going to be the evidence I needed to prove that. My own one. It just took me 30 minutes to sit there peacefully while life tried to poison me. At first it was mild to see as Caroline's fingers trembled a little around the coffee cup handle, hardly perceptible, just a tiny hesitancy in her hold, but I could see it observed everything. Jessica was sitting next to me, her body rigid despite her easy grin. She attempted to act as though she wasn't watching, but her eyes were fixed on her face every few seconds, seemed to be waiting for something to happen as she flicked toward me, then at Caroline, and then back to me. Caroline exhaled and shifted, in her chair, rubbing her fingertips over the surface. The issue wasn't happening to me. Jessica mumbled under her breath, "I feel weird," as if she was attempting to get rid of a headache. Carol scowled, her head snapping back and her smile wavering for a brief moment. Her typically keen eyes appeared distracted as she blinked a few times. She whispered, flexing her fingers, I'm having trouble keeping up with the conversation. Just off my hands feel tingly. Jessica's fingers curled around the table's edge, her knuckles going white, and my stomach. Perhaps you didn't eat enough, or it was just the heat, she replied abruptly, making you laugh. This morning, I pretended to be unaware while leaning back and laying my arms carelessly along the chair. My heart was racing. I was familiar with that sensation from experiencing the nausea too often. The disorientation that tilts the universe begins as a pit in your stomach and spreads like an invisible illness. The sudden tingle in your fingers is just enough to throw you off. I had already experienced weakness in my limbs, and now Caroline was experiencing it as well. Looked down at the coffee cup in front of me, which should have been mine, but the steam was still unspoiled. Curling languidly into the air, the odd metallic smell continued to torment. Jessica reached for her own cup, but she didn't take a sip from it. As I waited, I noticed that her breath caught when awareness struck. Her back straightened and her eyes widened in fright for a split second before she put on a mask. Oh no, she was aware that this was more than a coincidence or a case of paranoia. She had anticipated that I would drink that coffee, therefore she had prepared this on my behalf. The coffee was tainted, and she felt the weight of her error as she saw Caroline's body betray her. She had poisoned my own wife, so I looked at Caroline and carefully examined her. Her fingers were now holding the table as though to steady her. Keen tongue, and her breathing had become a little faster, had been replaced with lethargic bewilderment. I remarked, keeping my voice light, "What exactly did you put in that coffee, Jess?" Casual. Jessica winced when I pointed out to her that Caroline didn't look very nice. It's odd, since that's exactly how I felt, sister, who was now putting a hand to her tummy. Let's pretend that Jessica laughed during the last 5 meals I've had at your sister's place, but it was too loud. I tilted my head because I've been pitching Nathan, which is absurd. I was admitted to the hospital 3 times in the past 6 months, each time with symptoms that no one could explain, and I no longer consume the coffee. But Caroline drinks it and then gets sick all of a sudden. That's quite the coincidence. You're being paranoid. Don't you believe Jessica's throat bobbed as she swallowed? Caroline groaned quietly and rubbed her forehead, but Jessica's voice was quieter now, nearly out of breath. What was in Jessica's coffee mask? I saw a glimpse of something primal, but it was only a fleeting flash. Caroline, don't be too crazy. She just snapped because she was in a panic. Caroline looked up at her face pallid, a bit too defensively. Remarked, slowly getting to your feet. You know that it's not just coffee, don't you? Jessica's gaze flitted from me to Caroline and back again, captivated. I took my phone out of my pocket and used a quick finger flick to open it. The recording app I've been running ever since she placed the cup in front of me. See what's going to happen, I stated in a steady voice. Transporting across the table, I'm going to dial 911 so Caroline can receive the care she requires. And Jessica's hands are squeezed into fists, and I'm going to make sure they do a thorough toxicological screen. You're blowing this, she hissed out of proportion, so I arched a brow. Then why do you seem like you just saw a ghost, but she didn't respond? Caroline let out a trembling breath. Jessica. She shook her voice and pressed her fingers to her chest, telling me the truth. Jessica's lips parted when you added something to her coffee, but she didn't have to say anything. When I hit the 911 call button, there was silence. What is your emergency? Yes, I did say in a firm voice that I needed an ambulance at Willow Creek Drive at 12:07. Jessica, the sister-in-law, seems to be experiencing a serious response to something in her coffee. Her breath caught, lost command of the circumstance, and it was now my turn to determine how far this would go. The air in the dining room expanded as soon as I hung up with 911. Jessica's face was so thick that it had lost all of its color, and her fingers were clenched. Caroline's forehead was wet with tears as she moaned and clenched her fists at her sides. I closely observed Jessica as she gripped the edge of the table with perspiration, as if she was attempting to ground herself. In reality, was too silent, didn't run to Caroline's side, and didn't try to console her, displaying a loving sister's panic as she watches her sibling suffer. But she was C. Figuring out how to talk her way out of this was something her mind was doing over time, and I wasn't going to give her a chance. You didn't think I would contact you, did you? You assumed that I would be the one hunched over this table, too weak to think clearly, yet I spoke in a calm yet firm tone. Jessica's lips pressed into a tight line as she fought back. You're being... This is simply Carol, she mumbled, but her voice lacked conviction. Line most likely simply has a low coffee tolerance. I laughed without amusement. Correct, as the symptoms of caffeine poisoning closely like those I had last month, and the month prior to that, in the Nathan stopped it when Jessica's nostrils flared a month before, and I took a hesitant stride. I lowered my voice toward her, saying, No, stop it. No more gaslighting, no more brushing. I signaled that I knew what had been happening to me and that she now does too. Caroline, who was now clearly trembling, and guess what, Jessica? You created. You attempted to poison me once more today, but the wrong person drank it. Tell me what was in that coffee, please. Jessica's gaze flashed to the front door as though she may run. At that moment, Caroline gasped sharply and said, What did you do? To Jess. When Jessica whipped her head in the direction of her sister, her panic almost turned into something sharper. She snapped, So why do you look so desperate? I didn't do anything. I tilted my head in fear and said, You should be concerned about Caroline, right? Now you're worrying about something else, right? Jessica turned to her eyes were dark and agitated, and Nathan paused to consider why I would ever. I made another step forward in an attempt to harm you. Isn't that the question? Caroline's fingers curl feebly against the table as she lets out a trembling breath. At the board meeting, she gasped, Oh my God! With a look of awareness on her face. I sensed something chilly when Jessica froze, and I saw the crack in her armor sink into my chest. I had a hunch that Caroline's voice was weak, but her comments sliced like a dagger through the tension. Which is why, isn't it? You've been treating Ian like this. She raised her head, her eyes dreamy yet full of betrayal. You wanted him to move aside, but Jessica clenched her teeth. Caroline gave a sour, raspy laugh. What are you talking about? Oh, I believe, she turned to face me, her eyes blazing with shame that I hadn't anticipated. Nathan, I should have noticed that and realized what she was doing. I scowled. I sighed. Deeply, Jessica has been vying for your job for months. Naturally, the Henderson account is the largest, and I am slowly balling my fingers into fists. The deal that could alter everything was the client of the year, and I was in charge of the pitch Jessica worked at. The same company, but she had been having trouble getting big accounts. She was skilled at what she did, but she lacked the Henderson. Had asked me directly, and she must have thought it was a sign of the reputation I had developed over the years. Caroline's voice was heavy with regret as she continued to express how unjust it was. She must have felt threatened since I was in her way. Thought you were depriving her of possibilities, as she was the one who should have been managing the company's largest clients. She laughed haltingly and humorously, which I assumed was just I was unaware that she had truly broken off her speech with a shudder of anguish. Jessica said, I stared at her. What wasn't supposed to be like this? As her hands began to shake. Supposed to be like this, she showed me a raw and desperate side when she gazed up at me. Eyes a chilly, lonely quiet, stretched something you weren't supposed to understand. You were only intended to miss the one meeting between us, she acknowledged, her voice barely audible above a whisper. Just one to make them believe you were untrustworthy, so they let me take the initiative instead. Her voice broke. But you persisted. Despite everything I did, you continued to show up, and eventually they awarded you. Her breath came quickly after the following significant account, followed by the next. Angry gasps. Do you understand what it's like to put in twice as much effort only to be ignored repeatedly? She yelled. I stared as her voice rose, demanding that all you deserve be given to someone else. Jessica's face as she looks at her incredulously. You think you deserve my job? Yes, she spit, and I do, since I put in just as much effort as you do. Twisted with something unsightly. However, when you're there, no one ever recognizes me. I'm simply Jessica. Another worker, your wife Asterisk, shook her breath, and I wondered if you only ever got sick once, and when I finally had a chance, my stomach churned. Caroline laughed painfully and wheezed. Well done, Caroline wrote. Your opportunity, and now you're going to jail for it. Jessica's face is twisted in fear. Caroline. No, I didn't intend for this to occur. Please stop talking. I sounded like ice. Jessica. I trembled, took out my phone once more, and tapped the screen, recording everything. Her eyes widened as I stated icily, You just admitted to poisoning me. When I interrupted you. I didn't want to imply that it didn't important. And the cops are already en route. Jessica's visage changed into something I could hardly recognize, a mix of panic, anger, and she began to speak in utter shock, but was interrupted by the distant sound of sirens. Caroline inhaled as her head swung toward the window, and her hands began to shake fiercely. For the first time since, she muttered, You're done, Jess. Shakily. As the sirens grew louder, and Jessica knew she was lost, this nightmare began. Jessica's breathing accelerated, and she appeared to be a cornered animal with eyes darting toward the windows and front door. Hallway or anywhere else that could provide a route out, but there was nowhere to flee, so I stood staring at her. Caroline was holding my phone by my side as if it were my lifeline, since at the moment The paramedics arrived at the front door a moment later, their voices brisk. And competent as they approached Caroline, one of them inquired, now kneeling, next to her, what her symptoms were. I suggested moving back to give them space because she feels weak, lightheaded, and queasy. Caroline moaned as one of the medics examined her, since her hands have been shaking and she's having problems staying balanced. Pulse, then illuminated her eyes with a flash, causing her pupils to dilate. He whispered to Jessica, his co-worker, stood motionless, observing his potential harmful reaction. The paramedic turned to her, her eyes wild, and asked, Do you know what she's ingested? Jessica's mouth opened, and I said quietly, Closed. No words came out. She drank my coffee. The paramedic's wife cooked it especially for me. He looked at Jessica, his face impassive. Do you know what was in it? Jessica muttered. I just made regular coffee, and her lips quivered. I pulled Jessica's confession reverberated throughout the room as I pulled out my phone and hit play on the recording. You were only meant to should skip just one meeting. Leading them to believe that you were untrustworthy of the paramedics, his demeanor instantly changed from one of neutral concern to something far more when his head shot up. Caroline cried as two medics carried her onto a stretcher, indicating that we really need to get her to the hospital. I answered hastily, Pain. I'll ride with her. Jessica stepped toward me. Her expression I pivoted on my heel and left her, standing there, pale Nathan. The ride to the hospital was stressful, and Caroline's breathing was shallow when the police car drew into the driveway. And even with the blanket wrapped over her, she trembled fiercely every few minutes. I sat next to her and watched, passively while the medical staff monitored her vitals and gave her oxygen. Nathan, you knew, didn't you? I swallowed because I suspected she let I didn't reply, so I guess we both learnt the hard way. I let out a weak, sour laugh. Nothing could be said when we got to the hospital. Staff hurried her into a treatment room, and a doctor asked me a lot of questions about what she consumed when the symptoms began. After telling them everything, I gave them my phone and filmed her confessing to it, which I subsequently shared with the attending physician. I'm willing to wager that this isn't the first time my wife has done this. according to Caroline's toxicology report. Expression dark, will conduct all required tests. And after 2 hours, I waited in the waiting area with my hands locked together. I relived every moment in my mind. Had the months of sickness, the deceptions, the rejections, the cautious manner in which Jessica coordinated everything, and everything came together perfectly. She had meticulously prepared this. She had not only wanted me to skip the initial meeting, but she had exacerbated the situation once that failed. As the symptoms worsened, she gradually increased tests to see how far she could go before being discovered, and when she had finally gone too far, a door opened, yanking me out of my thoughts. Dr. Phillips, a tall woman with silver streak hair and keen eyes, walked. She told me that she is stable and that we were able to flush the most of. She is frail due to the toxins in her system, but she will get better. I let out a breath, didn't know I was holding, and Dr. Phillips briefly examined me. Were justified in their concerns. After the toxicology result verified the existence of a highly potent, yet non-lethal, we're conducting additional research, but the preliminary findings indicate that Chemical 1 shouldn't be included in any food or beverage. She hesitated before giving me a medication, which made my jaw tighten. The screen displayed a list of chemical substances and medical terminology that, save from one word, I could hardly understand. I uttered the word rodenticide in a scarcely audible whisper, and Dr. Phillips coldly nodded. Small doses of slow-acting poison are frequently utilized in pest control over time. Causes muscle weakness, nausea, and exhaustion, but in concentrated doses. She matched my look. It might be deadly. She wasn't merely attempting to undermine me, she was attempting to murder me. The doctor said, "Would you be willing to speak with law enforcement?" I exhaled slowly, as I already had evidence. "And I won't give up until she makes amends." Dr. Phillips nodded as though she had anticipated nothing less, and suddenly a voice spoke out. "Nathan," in the peaceful house at the hospital. I turned to see Jessica standing. At her hair was a little unkempt, and she was breathing irregularly as 2 uniformed police officers entered the waiting area. Officers were on either side of her, their hands in their holsters, and they didn't say a thing. One of them told Jessica to look into my eyes, and I couldn't quite make out what it was, fear and desperation. The officer closest to me muttered, "I apologize. I didn't mean to." My blood turned cold. She stepped forward. "Nathan Bennett," and I got up because I needed a formal declaration from you. Glaring at my wife, the person I had previously trusted, and who had shown me affection, I said, "My voice is steady, and I'm ready to talk," or at least I appeared to be calm. Jessica opened her mouth to make a beseeching plea, but she knew she had. The officer turned to her after she had already lost. "Jessica Bennett, you are being arrested for reckless endangerment. Conspiracy to cause harm and attempted poisoning reverberated across the Nathan." I held up a hand as Jessica took a short breath in the corridor. As the officers led, I turned away from her as her face broke. Dr. Phillips put a hand on my shoulder as they walked down the hall, their footsteps slamming against the tile floor. "This isn't—" I nodded. "But it wasn't over yet," she said. But for the first time in a Jessica was the one in danger for a long time, and she was going to cover the costs of his IED into the little clean room. The fluorescent lights of the hospital hummed softly above me, revealing what she had done. The interrogation room's walls were painted a drab beige, and the air was thick with an eerie silence over the metal. Jessica was sitting at a table with her wrists tied, her stance rigid, and she appeared odd, not only physically, but her hair was messier than I'd expected because of the tension of the previous few hours. Never witnessed it. And although her eyes were filled with fatigue, it was something more profound. For the first time in our marriage, she, Jessica, who appeared diminutive, had always been calculating and in control. Type of woman who could enter a room and give orders without letting a single hair fall out of place attention with just one look. But now she was ready to hear just that in a police interrogation room. She didn't realize how much of her life was about to fall apart. As I sat down across from her and folded my hands on the table, met my eyes, and I questioned, "Why, Jessica?" in a stern, quiet voice, and her shoulders were tined. Jessica murmured, "Don't act like you don't know," while continuing to avoid eye contact. "I want to hear it from you," she said. "I have told you it wasn't supposed to be this way, so I'm a little nervous and breathless," sneered. "Oh, you just wanted to make me sick, not kill me," which is why she winced at the irony in my tone. But I didn't mind, because I had to realize that I kept talking even though I needed to know how the woman I married was. The woman I loved was capable of doing this. At last, she raised her eyes, and for a split second, I had a glimpse of something beneath the icy calculating. Jessica took a slow breath, either out of remorse, embarrassment, or the fear of being discovered. "You know what?" Nathan murmured quietly. "What would it be like to be invisible?" Murmured. "What the hell are you talking about?" I scowled at Jessica, chuckled bitterly. "You don't understand. You never needed to understand. Everything has always been so simple for you," she said. "People listen when you enter a room after—" She sharpened her fingers and curled them into fists. "They want to collaborate with you because they respect you, yet I've spent years. I breathed out through my nose to control my emotions while pounding my ass at that corporation, and no one ever noticed me." Jessica clenched her jaw. "But it wasn't your solution to decide to poison me. You keep claiming that I leaned forward, but it did her more harm than good. I only wanted a chance, a genuine chance." But her throat bobbed as she swallowed forcefully. "You were there to take advantage of every promotion, every significant customer, and every chance I believed I had. A count I put twice as much effort into because her voice faltered. So first I shook my head, wanting you to slow down just enough so that everyone could finally see me. Head in shock. You don't harm people you care about." Jessica blinked quickly, as though my words had hit her, but she didn't dispute it. "The worst part is that I asked, my voice getting louder, rough, even if I didn't want to believe it when I started becoming unwell. I trusted you." That Jessica's jaw tightens and her face becomes twisted. "But you? Did I squint because it was hard to ignore the truth? You made sure of the dense quiet that hung between us, filled with all the things that were not said." Then, gently, Jessica spoke once more, and I turned my head to see how Caroline was doing. For the first time since everything began, Jessica appeared truly terrified as she exhaled slowly. "Will she be all right?" I stated cautiously that Caroline is stable, not for herself, but she could have passed away, Jessica. Her hands were shaking against the table, and she almost whispered to herself that she wasn't supposed to drink it. I leaned forward, but it was never intended for her, and I was never meant to figure it out. However, Jessica's eyes finally locked with mine, and I saw reality for the first time. She showed sorrow, but it wasn't quite enough. "Do you regret it?" inquired, and she let out a loud gasp, catching me. "Yes," I laughed coldly, shaking my head. "Of course, because if I had simply followed your instructions and continued to drink everything you offered me, you would still be winning, right?" Jessica didn't respond, so that's what I would still be feeling. I assumed there would be a lengthy pause before Jessica took a deep breath and squared. I looked at her for a second and she whispered, "I should talk to my lawyer." Then slowly nodded. "Yeah, you should." I got up and pushed the chair back. Something flashed in Jessica's eyes. Perhaps she had hoped for some sort of response or had anticipated me saying more. Forgiveness. But after everything I've done, Jessica, I wasn't offering it. Your voice was unyielding and firm. You made your decisions and now have to live with them. She simply observed as I turned and left the room the second I entered the room without arguing or pleading. Jessica had spent months attempting to undermine me and weaken me, yet she eased the burden off my chest in the hallway. I was still standing and prepared to see her fall, but I hadn't. I knew there was no turning back after I left that questioning room because Jessica had betrayed me. It was real, no longer a suspicion or a nightmare that tormented me during the still hours of the night, and she was now leaving. Detective Morrison, the lead investigator, met me outside to collect the payment. He was a tall, broad-shouldered, weary-looking police officer who had witnessed far too many of humanity's darkest sides, he muttered, letting out a breath as I crossed my arms and read through a little notepad that caught my attention. He nodded in agreement with everything Jessica said, including her confession. What she didn't say was plenty to validate my suspicion that this wasn't a simple miscommunication or a desperate. Morrison closed his notepad, gave me a long, evaluating glance, and said, "Woman, you made a mistake. It was intentional." Pursuing formal accusations, but in order to make sure this stands up in court, we need proof than just her statements. So I squared my, "What do you need?" shoulders. He gestured for me to follow him down the hallway. "Obtained a search warrant for your house already," Morrison clarified, as we strolled. "Whether she has been poisoning you for. She had to store whatever she was using for months because your sister-in-law's toxicology report was already in place. Confirmed that she was taking foreign drugs that weren't merely found in coffee." I clenched my jaw. "So if we find the source," after which we had a strong case. Morrison verified that we arrived at the My. Heart was racing when I saw the two uniformed officers standing by their patrol car at the main hospital entrance. Into my rib cage as the present reality struck in, focusing only on Jessica's existence, which she had meticulously constructed so desperately shielded was about to collapse. And for the first time, I didn't care when we got there. It seemed strange to enter the house where I used to live after the officers had moved in. I moved efficiently around the rooms, opening drawers and cabinets and even looking behind the refrigerator. You lived with Jessica, and I watched from the doorway of our bedroom while one of the officers searched her nightstand. Morrison asked me every day if she ever seemed anxious like she was. Concealing something, I exhaled slowly. She was extremely cautious and never revealed anything blatantly evident. But I knew Jessica and knew she wasn't unstoppable. We proceeded to the kitchen where an officer was already searching the spice cabinet, and another was examining the I followed them too. The pantry, where the detective in charge of gathering evidence turned to Morrison. The officer took out a little black box from the lower cabinet next to the sink and carefully placed it on the counter. Appeared to be a routine storage container at first, but when they opened it, the room's atmosphere changed. There were tiny, properly labeled vials of things in bottles that I didn't. Morrison picked up one of his expressions and recognized others with their original prescription labels and some without. He said, "Tech isn't something you buy at a grocery store," and I looked at the supporting documentation. Collection that had been making my stomach turn for so long, Jessica had been keeping track of. One of the cops gave me a piece of folded paper that she had been using on me as if I were an experiment. I unfolded this, my hands clenching around the edges in case you wanted to see it. A list of dates, dosages, and effects, which she had meticulously recorded each time. I experienced headaches, ER visits, and inexplicable illnesses. Morrison said, "Sickness." Jessica wrote it all down like she was doing some sick, twisted study. Low whistle, I gulped hard, felt my pulse roar in, and this is damning. The revelation hit me like a truck, you're telling me, and she never intended to stop if I hadn't swapped that cup with Caroline's. Would I have survived the subsequent dose if I hadn't begun to wonder? Morrison gestured to the officer's bag, and the notion of whether she would have gone all the way chilled me. I observed from a distance as Jessica was taken from her detention cell to the station where everything was finished. She didn't struggle or attempt to flee in a separate interrogation room, but when she saw me through the window, she paused briefly and I noticed a glint of regret in her eyes, or simply apprehension about what might occur next. Detective Morrison motioned for me to enter the observation room from I could see and hear everything here, but Jessica was unable to see me because he was sitting. Morrison moved forward as Jessica's whole body tightened as she placed the black box on the table across from her with a thump. "Recognize this, don't you?" She didn't respond, and he kept notes, touching the piece of paper I already read that you kept track of each time. "You poisoned your husband, Morrison slanted. The effects were so intense that you had to make it stronger every time Jessica's jaw constricted. His head told me, Jessica. Was Nathan simply an issue you were having, or was there ever going to be a time when you stopped?" She took a strong breath, intending to eliminate it permanently, but she didn't. Morrison sat back and shook his head, refusing to acknowledge it. "This is the situation you're in." He pointed at the vials and said, "Many charges, and believe me, none of them are going away. The evidence speaks for itself. These substances do not simply wind up in someone's coffee by chance." Jessica's hands quivered a little in her handcuffs. Morrison sliced through what was left of it, but I wasn't attempting to save it. "You must choose whether to cooperate or fight this in court." Jessica's face twisted and her breath was unsteady. Since we both knew the truth, and there was no turning back now, Morrison didn't need to press her. Even though I wanted to feel terrible for Jessica because she had ruined her life on her own, I felt justice couldn't have done this, and the courtroom fell silent as the judge. I sat in the front row with my hands clenched as his countenance became unreadable. Together we watched Jessica being escorted inside. She didn't resemble the lady I had married. She was thinner and weaker, as if she didn't look at me once the lengthy trial was over, since the burden of her sins had finally fallen on her shoulders. Arduous and excruciatingly public, the media had seized the story at an early stage. The specifics of the prominent businessman's career-destroying poisoning by his own wife were two. It was sensational that they disregarded Jessica's defense team, who had done everything in their power to portray her as a lady who was motivated. To despair under pressure from a competitive sector and overshadowed by her husband's success, they maintained that her intention was merely to level the playing field and not to create irreversible injury. But the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution had shown everything in detail, starting with according to toxicological reports, the chemicals discovered in Caroline's system were linked directly to the vials that were found in our house. Different dosages of slow-acting poison had been employed, just enough to get people sick without raising any red flags right away. The jury was shown my covert recordings from the brunch where Jessica admitted to undermining me. Her speech, which was filled with entitlement and annoyance, sealed her doom 3 times the pattern that was recorded. Jessica's thorough record of my symptoms, which was handwritten and found in our kitchen cupboard, had been very incriminating. Prosecutors described it as a systematic experiment in witness mistreatment. Caroline had testified, her voice trembling, as she described how over the years, my co-workers at work testified about my inexplicable ailments, but Jessica had ignored her worries. How Jessica had quietly raised concerns about my dependability due to my deteriorating health when the lead prosecutor I knew it was over when he gave his closing remarks. This was no coincidence. Declaring that this was premeditation, Jessica Bennett paced the courtroom floor aggressively, noticed a barrier and took calculated action rather than acting in a desperate manner. And her spouse, and rather of exerting more effort, she attempted to get rid of him. Jessica stood dumbfounded while the jury was dismissed to ponder. They returned 2 hours later without much delay. My heart was racing when the judge requested the forers to read the verdict. Jessica took a deep breath once the jury found the defendant guilty on all counts. When the mask finally cracked, I took a deep breath and briefly closed my eyes. Given the overwhelming evidence, the judge didn't spend any time in ruling that Jessica was given a 25-year prison sentence without the chance of release. The words, "a final, indisputable reality that I didn't celebrate," was mirrored in the courtroom. Didn't applaud because Jessica had lost her freedom and nobody had triumphed in the end. Profession and all of the things she had previously valued, and I had lost a lady. Once I went outside the courthouse following the sentencing, the sharp reporters were already pouring in, their cameras flashing as they yelled questions about how, if you had the chance, what would you say to Jessica now that justice has been done? I chose to ignore them, because in reality I felt nothing, not even relief or fury. Nathan's gentle voice drew me out of my reverie with a tone of satisfaction but tiredness. I turned to see Caroline standing a few steps away, her face steady but pale. Recovering, but she appeared more resilient than she had been on the day. She was admitted to the hospital. "Are you okay?" I questioned, and she gave me a little sour look. "My sister was recently sentenced to prison for attempting to poison my brother-in-law, so no, I'm not really okay." Sighing, I agree. For a long time, neither of us said anything. Then Caroline trembled. She muttered, "I don't understand her," because she had everything going well: career, a devoted husband, and a life she created out of nothing. I didn't reply straight away as I didn't comprehend it either. I believe Jessica ultimately persuaded herself that nothing she owned would ever be sufficient. I thought back to the courtroom as Caroline exhaled and rubbed her arms against the cold, as if she regretted it. I don't know whether I admitted, but it doesn't explain Jessica's expressionless gaze at the table while the judge read her sentence. "Really matter anymore?" Caroline nodded, as Jessica's regrets ultimately wouldn't alter a thing. She had made her decisions and now had to live with them. Months went by, and life progressed slowly. Jessica's trial had been a spectacle, but people quickly discovered new stories to fixate on. The headlines dwindled, the office whispers subsided, and I recovered. But it wasn't quick or simple. But I gradually restored the after hearing the Henderson narrative, the very deal Jessica had attempted to ruin. My career was cemented. The firm reaffirmed their belief in me after the trial, giving me more chances to succeed and gain new clients. Jessica attempted to ruin me more than I could have ever imagined, and ultimately, all 1 year later, as I stood at the podium of a business function, gazing out at the sea, she had strengthened me. Of faces in front of me, I received an invitation to speak as the keynote speaker as a testament to my perseverance and hard work. Honoring my accomplishment, I took the mic and waited for the situation to calm down. I mentioned that talent and hard work aren't the only factors that lead to success. Integrity is about the connections we make and the trust we gain. I took a moment to. Sometimes, as my thoughts drifted back to everything I had experienced, I carried on when the people closest to us present the toughest challenges in our lives, we have two options. We can allow it can either break us or give us energy. A soft whisper swept across the audience. Faintly grinned, decided to get up, finished, and am now standing here. The crowd exploded in applause as a result, and I shook hands with my co-workers as I left the podium. I came to the realization that, despite Jessica's attempts to steal everything away from me, I was ultimately the one who won 1 year. The trial had concluded precisely 1 year prior. 1 year after I left that courthouse with Jessica when she was given a 25-year prison term. The burden of betrayal, relief, and fatigue simultaneously. But in spite of, I took a slow drink of my coffee and realized that I was still here, stronger, and thriving. Before placing it on the gleaming mahogany desk in front of me, the first cup I had really savored in a long time. Except for the distant buzz of traffic outside the high-rise window, where the skyline stretched before me, the office was quiet. I had sat in here a year ago as a reminder of how much had changed in just 12 months. My thoughts were muddled by betrayal and uncertainty, slowly eating away at me. Poison, my personal life had gotten worse, and my job had been in ruins. I spent months wondering how I could have been so naive, and how I had let someone I loved so much to turn against me. But that was back then, and following the trial, I was performing at my best right now. Jessica attempted to ruin the Henderson account, which turned out to be one of our most successful campaigns. Firm had ever dealt with customers. My reputation increased, and as Jessica dissolved into insignificance, I rose higher than before, and I looked up at Nathan. From my desk, my assistant Lauren entered the office. "You have a call from Nashville State Online as well." Corrective. I went, but I didn't have to ask Jessica who it was. Conversed with her since the trial hadn't been documented, hadn't paid her a visit. And yet here, Lauren hesitated before telling me that she was reaching out from the jail cage that she had so meticulously designed for herself. "They're not available." I debated while staring at my phone's blinking light. I said, "Yes, do that." And she shot me a knowing glance before vanishing down. I leaned back in my chair and softly exhaled in the hallway. Jessica had already taken enough of my time, trust, and peace of mind that I wasn't willing to part with. Another second that night when I went to dinner with Caroline, it had sort of become a custom to check in with each other, ensuring that we were both recovering in our own ways. She had suffered following the trial too, losing her sister. I gave her a glass of water and asked, "Guess who called me today?" Despite everything Jessica had done. Drink Jessica, she didn't even think twice. I arched my eyebrow. "How do you know, Caroline?" She laughed wearily when she called me last week. I scowled and she shrugged. She apologized for everything and asked if I could assist her file an appeal, which I dismissed. "Yes," Caroline claims. She wasn't in anything when she swirled the wine in her glass, her right mind that she didn't intend to harm you. I thoroughly examined her. I believe she regrets it, but not because she hesitated and then sighed. She apologizes. I believe she regrets being discovered. I nodded, and that's precisely what Caroline bent her head, and I wondered, "Are you going to come see her?" I gave a little. She didn't protest, so she just raised her glass to move instead of laughing. Moving forward, I lifted mine in exchange for months of media coverage. For the first time, I stopped thinking about Jessica, and others stopped whispering about the trial. For the first time in years, I could get out of bed and go to a meeting at work without feeling like I had to watch over my shoulder. One day, while I was getting ready for another, I had customers who lived my life fearlessly. High-profile pitch. I nearly disregarded the email notice that buzzed on my phone. I didn't notice the Henderson account contract renewal subject line until I sat back after opening it right away and reading the statement that they were renewing their contract for an additional 3 years. Jessica had attempted to take a seat in my chair with a gradual smile on my face. Everything from me, yet I was still winning that in spite of anything she did. I went to the lake this past weekend. I hadn't been there since before anything happened, but I stood there and watched I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in a long time as the lake rippled in the afternoon sun. I took out my phone and I went through my saved messages and, taking a big breath, erased each one. Every single one of Jessica's texts, in which she appeared to care and played the role of the wife, I deleted each one of the ones where she made passive-aggressive comments regarding my profession, success, and future. Them, and I felt lighter after deleting each message. Freer Jessica's name, no longer had influence over me. It was her decisions, betrayal, and demise. Carrie now, not mine. And as I made my way back to my vehicle, I took one more glance at the eye grinned at Lake. Not because I was feeling happy or because she had lost, but because after I had finally achieved the peace she had never been able to find.